Oh, hi. Ooh, kind of far away. 1 second. Perfect. Hello and welcome back to my channel where we dress so that nobody sits next to us on the bus. Oh, my name is Hannah, aka the woman in wool. No, I'm gonna put this here. And we chat history. I also crochet, but I'm gonna try to do a little bit more shots of me crocheting. Today we're knitting in a color that is not a neutral, we'll call it that, neon yellow, because the person I'm making it for is colorblind and they specifically requested this color, so I'm excited to make sure that they can see it. Hi Rue. Rue watches all my videos. He's like a ride or die from day one, so I really appreciate that. That and like my mom. I don't even know if my mom watches all these videos. Anyway, YouTube's going well. I hope you can tell that from this. Oof. So if you're new here, you're not, it's fine. My name is Hannah. I am originally from New York, and in 2016 I moved to Dublin, and ever since then I have found a way to make it my entire personality. Anyway, I spent about 3 weeks writing out a very long, very educational, very thorough script about immigration of Irish folks to New York, the history of New York, European settlement that was there after the natives were kicked out, how the natives were treated, and including, but not limited to, also my childhood in the state of New York and how I grew up there. But then I realized that that's boring and nobody wants to watch that but me.
Nobody.
And with my most viral video at 80 views, I couldn't afford to lose my audience now. Then in my research, I came across the movie Gangs of New York. And I was like, I remember this movie. I last saw it, I think, in 2012, about 10 years after it came out. And I was like, a period drama? Irish controversy? Leo when he was age appropriate? This might be what I'm looking at. This might be my new video. So today we're chilling, making a neon hat that is literally washing out everything else and breaking down the gangs of New York alongside the actual Irish gangs that ran my childhood home, nearest metropolitan area. Also, just my normal disclaimer, I am not a historian or educated formally in this in any way. I'm just a dweeb with an internet connection, and I hope that you're as excited about that as my therapist is. Also, please like and subscribe, holy shit. I do this for fun, but it'd be nice to talk to people. First and foremost, if you haven't seen the movie, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview and a breakdown of the plot. So if you don't want spoilers from a movie that came out before NSYNC broke up, I suggest looking away and finding a different video. The movie is about groups of Irish immigrants in the mid-1800s in a really rough part of New York City called the Five Points.
A few crusty and a handful of ragtags.
The one main group that we're looking at is the Dead Rabbits. They are joined by a few other immigrant gangs in a fight scene that could rival Braveheart. Who are they fighting? They are fighting a gang of xenophobic, racist, native New Yorkers who want nothing more than for immigration to stop in New York City and to return to the Protestant manner of living that they were used to, or for the Protestants to take back New York City.
Us natives, born rightwise to this fine land, or the foreign hordes defiling it.
A lot of quotes in this sentence because, as we know, the native New Yorkers looked something like this, and not like this. The native New Yorkers gang leader is called Bill the Butcher, and he runs the streets through a combination of fear and manipulation of political figures. The two gangs fight it out, and the leader of the Dead Rabbits, Priest Vallon, ends up dead. So the native New Yorkers win. Just to let you know, I might forget to do the quotes, so if I call them the native New Yorkers, just know that that's what they consider themselves to be in this movie, and actually also in history. So the native New Yorkers, that's what they call themselves. So the man who dies, his name is Priest Vallon, and he's the leader of the Dead Rabbits. His son, Amsterdam, who is around 10 years old at the time, gets sent to a boys' home after his father dies. He's there for about 14 years until he's old enough to leave and go back to New York City on his own. And when I say back to New York City, the boys' home that he went to wasn't exactly away from New York City, but it was on an island off of New York City. There are a few islands off of New York City. Amsterdam then makes his way home, reunites with his old buddy and the girl who he's into, and subsequently she's into him. Surprise, surprise, this woman is also a criminal. Everyone's a criminal in this movie.
A handful of ragtag.
Amsterdam strategically makes his way into getting under the wing of Bill the Butcher, the guy who killed his father, who, of course, does not recognize him and makes him kind of his protege. Amsterdam then gets sold out by his old mate, who gets mad that he's boinking his crush. Amsterdam then goes full war mode on Bill the Butcher and reunites the gangs of New York. We said the title. Against the ever-present racism and impending civil war, Amsterdam and Bill the Butcher end up fighting to the death in the middle of New York City streets. With, surprise, surprise, Amsterdam coming out on top. Also, just a side note, I'm not sure if his name, Amsterdam, is a throwback to or like a call to New York City's original name when the Europeans originally settled in New York City, which was New Amsterdam. Everybody thanked They Might Be Giants for teaching us that one. Thank you, They Might Be Giants. That's how I learned it. I don't know how you learned it, but that's how I figured out that it was called New Amsterdam. The plot is pretty good, but in my belief, I think that Martin Scorsese just wanted to make a historical film and had to check all like the Hollywood boxes of like a sexy love interest and a revenge plot just to get it in the theaters, just so that he could like let his inner history dork out. Nowadays, he could have just had a YouTube channel dressed like a nonce. If only, eh, Martin? You could have been just like me. Anyway, that's the plot. Let's dig into the history. The movie opens up in 1846 in the streets of New York with an Irish gang. Already a great time if you want to make a movie about Irish tragedy voyeurism. If you want to make a movie about Irish tragedy, there is a lot to choose from, but in Hollywood, there are only 3 times. The famine from 1845 to 1852. Irish immigration to America in the early 1900s, because we have those very apropos signs that we can have close-ups of. And then, of course, the Troubles. Hollywood likes the Troubles because the clothes are kind of cool, and also it's tragedy. We love a good tragedy. Anyway, like I said, we open up in 1846 on the streets of New York in a place called the 5 Points, which was a real place. I was very pleasantly surprised with the historical density of the film and just how accurate it was. Of course, outside of the characters of like Amsterdam and Priest Fallon, which are fictional, a lot of the characters are actually real and they really existed. The 5 Points was a place where 4 streets converged and a 5th one was close enough by where they counted it anyway. I'm gonna read these off so this way I get it right. The streets were Anthony, now called Worth, Cross, now called Moscow, Orange, now called Baxter, and Little Water, which is now non-existent. They all convened in one spot, and Mulberry Street was the next street down. Mulberry Street is still around, and Mulberry Street is still called Mulberry Street in Manhattan. And this is pretty cool because it has a huge history that's seeped in like Italian immigration, and it's actually the very heart of what's called Little Italy now, where you can get the most incredible Italian food. My family and I used to go during Easter, but also it's just down the road from Chinatown in New York City. Chinatown is a place where you can get the most incredible fresh fish and seafood and also turtles in a bucket that are still alive. And yes, I did take a turtle that was meant to be eaten and raise it as a pet. And yes, I did go vegetarian as a child.
Snowflake.
The movie's opening scene is essentially the same as when you see orcs working on metal stuff in a cave in the ground, but actually it's just John C. Reilly. And this scene depicts him and Liam Neeson getting ready for the most 2002 fight scene that you've ever seen in a period drama.
Prepare to receive the true Lord!
These turf wars were pretty common in New York City for the smaller gangs that were running the streets before the more organized mafias came in later on in the late 1800s and early 1900s, especially in the 5 Points, which was considered a slum and a big immigration spot at the time. Now, from the sources I could find, these fight scenes would have been accurate for 1846 when the movie opens, but not so accurate by the time Leonardo DiCaprio's character actually comes back from the boys' home in 1860. The 5 Points was starting to turn itself around by 1860 because of a lot of Christian missionaries at the time that were worried for the area's salvation. Thanks. So while the movie is pretty historically accurate in most of its terms, from what I found on this other source, it would have been more accurate towards the 1830s and 40s, not so much the 60s, but I get where they're coming from. Hollywood, baby! Anyway, Liam Neeson's character dies, and his death scene is akin to a king dying, and bagpipes play in the background because he's Irish. Hollywood, baby! When Jack from Titanic's father dies, he ends up getting brought to a boys' home on Blackwell Island. And the institution he's brought to is called Hellgate. Lovely. Now, although there were places called Hellgate near enough to Manhattan, like there's a strait called Hellgate Strait, there was a bridge called Hellgate Bridge, I couldn't find an institution called Hellgate on an island, especially one that was labeled a House of Reform like the movie depicts. There is, however, a Blackwell's Island, or it was called Blackwell's Island, and its name was changed to Welfare's Island in 1921. It was changed to Roosevelt Island in 1971, and it is still called Roosevelt's Island today. It's so obvious how much Martin Scorsese loves history, just with all of the true facts that are coming through. It's so great, and my little dweeby fucking heart loves it so much. It's also important to note that this movie is kind of depicting a time where it's not only just reflecting New York's history, it's also reflecting US history and the world history, because there's a lot of factors that go into what New York City is experiencing at this time, obviously. And especially in US history, there is the ever-encroaching abolishment of slavery and the approach of the American Civil War in 1861. So just remember that because that's important. Now in the movie, we see a very apropos newspaper headline of, "As the Irish invade New York, The North invades the South. Invade. Now, I couldn't find a headline in newspapers.com. I think it's called newspapers.com. I'll link it down below, obviously. But I couldn't find the exact headline, but there was quite a few similar ones to choose from. We all know that the American sentiment towards European immigration at the time wasn't exactly warm. It was actually aggressive, but the American sentiment towards Irish immigration was especially bad. But why? Well, the first thing was that the Irish were mainly Catholic, at least the Irish that were coming over to America at the time. And most of the natively born Americans were Protestant at this time.
And may the Christian Lord guide my hand against your Roman popery.
America had come from puritanical roots, and much like that boomer aunt that everyone seems to have, these guys could not wrap their mind around sharing a landmass with somebody that was slightly different to them. Not only that, the Irish that were coming over were native English speakers and were white. So while other immigrants that were coming over might not be as much of a threat to jobs as the Irish were because they were not native English speakers, and Black Americans weren't so much of a threat to Native American jobs because of the racism at the time, Irish people could very easily get a job that a white American could have gotten for less money than they would have paid a white American. A lot of Americans considered this to be a threat, so the invading Irish was a prevalent sentiment at the time. And another voter that could have been voting against real American values. Yeah, a lot of this movie and time period makes you want to throw up. Anyway, that's my little tangent. In the movie, there is a character called Tammany. At least I thought he was a character until I started to dig in a little more. And he could have been named something else, but Tammany was the company or the entity that he represented. This character is a classic politician whose main motivation is to stay in power. Nothing like the politicians that we have today. To my surprise, Tammany was real, but he wasn't a person, which is what confused me. Lots of things confused me. But Tammany was a political organization in New York City. They were, from what I understand, a local faction of the Democratic Party and gained control over a lot of the policy and law being made in the area. Sometimes I have to read things because I don't remember. There is a plot point in this story where Tammany actually supports Irish politicians being brought into power. And this is actually true. They did help Irish immigrants gain power in New York City. Now, side note, this could have been like in the movie where they were just trying to get the Irish vote, which was a growing voter base in New York City at the time, but they did back Irish political candidates.
Or shall I be your chosen voice in the New Testament, in the New World?
Tammany Hall is still around in New York City today, if you want to go visit. Here's a picture of it. Also, before we go any further into this, I just think it's important to note that there were a few choices in this movie that were made, including Leonardo DiCaprio's character, who was born and raised in New York City, to have an Irish accent.
I'm none taken, sir. I grew up here. All I ever knew of Ireland was in the talk of the others at the orphan asylum.
And Cameron Diaz's character.
Well, gentlemen, I leave you in the grace and favor of the Lord.
Look, I'm not an accent expert, but it was a choice that they chose to choose for a choice that was chosen. It was a choice. Anyway, let's get on to the good stuff. The gangs, the actual gangs of New York. Who were they? Were they real? Was it cool? What did they wear? God, it's like the Met Gala. So yes, they were real, and a lot of them featured in this movie. And they were, excuse me while I make sure that I get this right. They were 40 thieves, mostly Irish. They were said to have quotas for how much they had to steal daily, and their leader was Edward Coleman, a gentleman who was later hanged for beating his wife. The Bowery Boys. Again, mostly Irish. These fellows were a little different because they dressed in formal attire and they held down proper jobs. So this was more of an evenings and weekends gang, you know what I mean? You know, hobbies you have like killing and stealing. Then there was Leonardo DiCaprio's gang, the Dead Rabbits. These guys were real, but the only thing that I could find that went against what the movie said was that the Dead Rabbits teamed up with another gang called the Bowery Boys, whereas from what I could find, these two gangs were sworn enemies and didn't work together. Again, the Dead Rabbits were mostly Irish, but they were a little bit more open-minded. For example, they had women joining the violence. We love a girl boss. And actually, they had a particularly eager young woman named Hellcat Maggie. She is played by Cara Seymour in this movie. And she ran with the Dead Rabbits and allegedly filed her teeth into points and had Wolverine-style brass knuckles on her hands. Girl boss. The Daybreak Boys. These guys were known as river pirates. Awesome. Who would use rowboats to sneak into cargo ships in New York's various rivers and steal liquor. Fucking awesome. Martin Scorsese got everything, and even a boat scene. Honestly, New York seemed way cooler back then. Now all we have is like rights and safety and IPAs. So I mean, like, whatever floats your boat. As in the movie, there was also the O'Connell Guard, infamous for their red caps. The Plug Uglies, who confused me a bit because I got some conflicting information. I found them down as both a nativist gang and an Irish gang, but at this point Martin Scorsese has gained my trust, and I assume that they were Irish since they fought with the dead rabbits in the movie. So I'm just gonna give it to Martin Scorsese. We're gonna give him the points. And the shirt tails existed as well, but they were called this because they wore their shirts on the inside of their pants. So I guess you couldn't fucking see their shirt tails. I don't know why they called themselves that. But they did this because the Chinese laborers used to do this, and this was kind of a sign of affiliation. And last but not least, the Chichesters, who, despite their pip pip cheerio tea time posh boy English name, were Irish. Now, before the introduction of organized crime in the early 20th century, like the mafias, these smaller gangs ran the streets of New York City through political manipulation, fear, and violence. But unfortunately, there is something about men in vintage clothing that makes me go all warm and silly inside. Anyway, I think probably gonna ignore most of the plot for this movie because they just end up calling each other Patty all the time and making weird accents that sometimes make sense and sometimes don't. Everyone except John C. Reilly. John C. Reilly's accent was actually pretty good.
No, it's not an easy bill. No, I wouldn't say that. My allegiance is to the law. I'm paid to uphold the law.
Mr. Reilly, could you please make another movie with Will Ferrell? And up next on the oh my god, it's historically accurate, thank you Martin Scorsese list is the Civil War riots that were happening in New York City. Boom. In the 1860s, America was belatedly getting its shit together with the entanglement called the slave trade. Holy fuck. For example, England stopped its involvement with the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and in 1833 passed its Slavery Abolition Act. That took effect in 1834. So although the slave trade obviously never should have happened, America was pretty late to the game in stopping their involvement with the transatlantic slave trade because that wouldn't happen for the US until around 30 years later. So what was leading to this new abolition of slavery and change in thought? The American Civil War, baby. Stop saying baby. As probably most of you know, this was an all-and-out war that pretty much divided America cleanly through the middle. North versus South, brother versus brother, top versus bottom. Now, what I'm about to say is an incredible oversimplification of what kind of led to the American Civil War because there were plenty of factors that did that, and if I was going to make a video about the American Civil War, it would be way more in-depth than what I'm about to say right now. But essentially, it went something like this. The southern United States and the southern states of America ran most of their economy on agriculture. And to maintain this economy and keep pumping wealthy landlords full of money, that agriculture depended on free human labor known as slavery. The main crops were cotton, tobacco, and sugar. And to maintain this level of profit, landowners would ship people in like cattle from Africa. This was known as chattel slavery or cattle slavery. But that didn't matter for the rich slave owners in the southern United States because all they cared about was getting free labor to maintain a level of profit that was unsustainable and unhumane. Like I said, there's so much more that goes into the American slave trade, but I want to make sure to dedicate the time and respect to that topic that it deserves in a proper video, and I just wanted to make sure that people who are watching this video kind of get the general history of what the American Civil War was all about. Also, if I'm going to dedicate a video to the American Civil War, I'd like to get some sort of expert on there. So I'd probably have to wait until my platform grows a little bit or when my platform gains a little bit more of a following. So this way somebody who's an expert wants to be on my channel, and it's not just me in my living room knitting. Now, the northern United States didn't depend on agriculture so much and were manufacturers and processors of the raw materials that the South had. So the way the South saw it, of course the Northerners didn't need slavery. They had factories, they had workers. They didn't need the slaves that the South needed to maintain this level of profit. And the way the North saw it was that the concept of slavery was outdated and inhumane. Also, they didn't want the South to secede, which was what the South was threatening to do if the abolishment of slavery passed nationally or federally. Long story short, the government made it Facebook official. The United States was trying to break up, and they were about to fight. But how do you do that? Through a draft, baby! Forcing men to fight by calling them out to war that they didn't want to go to and had no say in whether or not it was going to happen. As you do, nobody liked it. So the last scene in this movie is a barrage of Civil War riots. People protesting and becoming violent over the idea of a draft being brought out against everybody's will. This resulted in the attack of government buildings and the destruction of government buildings alongside racist attacks. At this point, I'm not even surprised. Fucking the past was god-awful. Actually, no, you know what? Scratch that. That still happens today, and that shouldn't. We could get into that later. But right now, is this accurate? Were there all-out attacks because of the draft in the Civil War? Yes. Yep. Not going to drag it out? Yes, there were. And it was mostly middle-class folks or lower-class folks because they had no say in whether or not they got drafted. So in 1863, a 4-day-long riot broke out. They attacked draft headquarters and resulted in $1.5 million worth of damage. I couldn't find if this was past money or present money, but either way, that's a lot of money. And also like the movie, it was a lot of immigrants because immigrants from Europe were coming in and essentially going from one tragedy to another. So in Ireland, they were coming from a famine, one of the worst and most tragic times of their history, and given a gun and told to fight in a civil war for the country that they just got to. But also, as in the movie, I'm gonna read this off, if you had $300, you could beat the draft and avoid being shipped out to war. Perfect. The only problem was that the average income for the year for most people was $500. So how the fuck are you gonna give somebody $300? One of the worst parts of this is that white folks took this as an opportunity to attack who they saw were the root of the problem, which were freed black folks. And during these attacks, they were unfortunately targeted. I know that the northern United States like to pretend that lynchings didn't happen and that all happened in the South, but that's just not the case. And it's important, I think, to recognize the history of all of the United States and their history of racism so that we can move forward, said the white girl knitting in Ireland. But as we finish up this movie review, I'd like to call out just a few pristine moments of historical accuracy that Martin Scorsese lovingly sprinkled into this film. There was a nod to the gold rush that Cameron Diaz's character talked about when she wanted to move west and find gold. She lets Leonardo DiCaprio know that she's sick of warfare and wants to go somewhere else. Honestly, this character tends to run away. I think that's like her coping mechanism. The line, "She is Frenchified," while talking about a sex worker in a scene that takes place in a brothel. I'm reading this off so this way I don't forget. It's referring to syphilis. In the late 1400s, the French invasion of Naples, Italy, brought with it the first recorded outbreak of this disease, and it was nicknamed the French disease. Cute. However, by 1530, they did have the word for syphilis, but everybody just still likes making fun of the French, so some things never change, I guess. Black New Yorkers doing Irish jigs. In the middle scene, there is a small conversation about a young man who is either a former slave or a freed black man who is doing an Irish jig on the table in the bar. And I firmly believe that Martin Scorsese popped this in there just to let you know that it happened, because yes, Irish folks and black Americans were oftentimes living in close quarters with each other and often in the same neighborhoods. They had the same job opportunities, were both considered outcasts, and had comparable experiences at the time. Many black and Irish befriended each other and even married each other. So it's completely possible that there were cultural exchanges of dance, food, and potentially even language. I gotta say, overall, this movie was a 9 out of 10 for historical accuracy. Although the choices they chose to choose were chosen. Accents.
The grace and favor of the Lord.
But in terms of the history, Scorsese knocked it out of the park. I absolutely loved digging into this movie and finding all the little bits that were actually true. But I think if it was redone today, I think we probably would have gotten Irish actors to do the Irish accents. So here's my recasting for this movie. You're welcome. Nobody asked for this. Here we go. Priest Vallon. Still Liam Neeson. Love you, Liam Neeson. John C. Reilly can stay. The guy from Highlander can stay. Mad-Eye Moody can stay. But Amsterdam would be played by Cillian Murphy, obviously. Let's throw Chris O'Dowd in there. Our girl Saoirse Ronan as the love interest. Sorry, Cameron Diaz. Love you, but we need an Irish girl. And I'm going to need somebody to write in a role for Nicola Loughlin, or she can play Hellcat Maggie, or just literally anybody from the Dairy Girl. And Bill the Butcher would be reprised by Leonardo DiCaprio. I think that would be fucking awesome. And that's it. Thanks so much for sticking around. I love making videos for all 19 of you. Hi, Mom. Hi, Rue. Like and subscribe. Follow me on all the social medias. I'll put them here. And all of my sites are in the description down below. As always, like I said, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be knitting for you. I'm happy to be yammering on about things that I think are cool. And if you like my outfit, let me know. I tried to dress as much like an early 2000s Leonardo DiCaprio as possible, because I think that's kind of a vibe now. I'm too old for this. Anyway, have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye. Oh shit. Let's get some shots of me knitting here. The dog's moving my camera. I assume that they were Irish. Whoops. In 1807. Was that true? No. Syphilis.